On October 6, 1996, someone fired an anti-tank rocket at the Hells Angels clubhouse in Copenhagen. Let me say that again. An anti-tank rocket in the middle of a European capital city. 2 people died that night. 3 more were torn apart by shrapnel. And the weapon that did it? It was a Swedish-made Carl Gustaf, the same launcher NATO armies use on the battlefield. This wasn't some bar fight that got out of hand. This was war. Real war, fought in the streets of Scandinavia between 2 of the biggest motorcycle clubs on the planet, the Hells Angels and the Bandidos. And what I'm about to walk you through will change how you think about biker rivalries forever. To understand how Scandinavia, one of the most peaceful corners of the world, turned into a biker war zone, you need to understand what was happening in the late 1980s and early 90s. The Cold War had just ended, Europe was reshuffling, and in countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, the outlaw biker scene was growing fast. According to research published by Sweden's National Crime Prevention Council in 2002, Scandinavia had seen a huge rise in outlaw MC clubs starting in the mid-1980s. Small, local clubs were popping up everywhere, clubs with names like Bullshit, Morticians, Morbids, Rebels, dozens of them. Here's the thing most people outside Scandinavia don't realize. These weren't chapters of big international clubs. Not yet. These were homegrown groups, guys who built their own clubs from scratch, local guys, mechanics, dock workers, ex-military. They had their own patches, their own rules, their own territories. But that was about to change, because 2 giants were coming. The Hells Angels had been eyeing Scandinavia for years. They saw the region the same way a franchise sees an untapped market. Organized local clubs, strong biker culture, and no major competition. Starting in 1980, they began absorbing Scandinavian clubs, first in Denmark, then Sweden, then Finland. Julian Schur and William Marsden documented this expansion in their 2003 book. The Angels didn't roll in and recruit strangers. They found the strongest local club in each country, courted them, and patched them over, meaning they turned an existing club into a Hells Angels chapter. Smart, efficient, and it worked. Think about what that really means for a second. You've been riding under your own patch for years, your own club name, your own identity, and then the biggest MC brand in the world knocks on your door and says, "You're with us now." Some guys saw it as an honor. Others saw it as a hostile takeover wearing a smile. And that split, the guys who said yes to the Angels and the guys who didn't, is the crack that blew the whole region apart. Because the clubs that didn't join the Angels, a lot of them went looking for their own superpower to back them up, and they found one, the Bandidos. The Bandidos MC, based out of Texas, started planting flags in Scandinavia in the late 1990s. First in France, then through Scandinavia through a club called Undertakers in Denmark and the Morbids in Sweden. Danish police intelligence noted that by the mid-1990s, the Bandidos had chapters in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. They were growing fast, and they were hungry for territory. Now you've got 2 global motorcycle empires standing nose to nose in some of the smallest, most tightly packed countries in Europe. Denmark is about half the size of South Carolina. Everybody's on top of everybody, and both clubs wanted to be the only game in town. That's a powder keg, and it was about to blow. The first shots of the Nordic Biker War, the Great Nordic Biker War as it became known, were fired in 1994, but the roots go back a bit further. Throughout the early 1990s, there were incidents, beatings, stabbings, a clubhouse torched here, a drive-by there, tit for tat, the kind of low-level violence that both sides could rationalize as just business. But on February 13, 1994, things crossed a line. A group of Bandidos-affiliated bikers opened fire at Helsinki Airport in Finland, right there in the arrivals terminal. Their target was a group of Hells Angels members coming off a flight. Bullets flew in a public airport. Bystanders dove for cover. Miraculously, nobody died, but the message was clear. Finnish investigators confirmed that the airport shooting was a planned ambush. This wasn't a random brawl. This was organized, this was intentional, and this was public. And that's the detail that changes everything. Up until this point, most biker violence in Scandinavia happened in the shadows, at clubhouses, on back roads, in parking lots after midnight. But an airport, in broad daylight, with families and tourists walking around, that was a declaration. That was both sides saying, we don't care who's watching anymore. From that point on, things escalated fast, really fast. Between 1994 and 1997, there were car bombings, drive-by shootings, arson attacks, and targeted assassinations across all 4 Scandinavian countries. The Bandidos hit Hells Angels targets. The Angels hit back. Then the Bandidos hit harder. It became a cycle that nobody could stop, or wanted to. Europol, that's the European Union's law enforcement agency, flagged the Nordic Biker War in their 1997 organized crime report. They called it one of the most serious organized crime conflicts in Western Europe. Think about that. Europe had dealt with the IRA, ETA, the Italian Mafia, and Europol was putting a biker war in the same conversation. Now, why does that matter? Because it tells you something about scale. This wasn't 2 gangs scrapping over a street corner. This was a conflict that had multiple governments worried. Police forces in 4 countries couldn't contain it. Intelligence agencies were sharing files on motorcycle club members the same way they shared files on terror cells. Let that sink in for a second. And the weapons were getting bigger. Both sides started using military-grade hardware. We're talking AK-47s, hand grenades, car bombs packed with enough explosive to gut a building. And this is the part that sounds made up but isn't: anti-tank missiles. Now here's where it gets truly insane, because up to this point you might be thinking, okay, this is bad, but it's gang violence. We've seen gang violence before. But what happened next went beyond anything anyone in Scandinavia had ever seen, beyond anything most of Europe had ever seen. On March 10, 1996, someone launched a rocket at the Hells Angels clubhouse in Helsingborg, Sweden. And we're not talking about a homemade pipe bomb. We're talking about a military anti-tank weapon, a weapon designed to punch through armored vehicles. Swedish police confirmed the weapon was a Soviet-made RPG. The rocket hit the building and detonated. By some miracle, no one inside was killed, but the building was shredded. Put yourself in the shoes of someone living on that street. You're in Helsingborg, a quiet port town in southern Sweden. Population maybe 80,000. You're watching TV on a Tuesday night and your neighbor's building gets hit by a weapon designed for the battlefield. This isn't Baghdad, this isn't Beirut, this is Sweden, the country famous for IKEA and ABBA, and there's a rocket crater in the street. And 7 months later, it got worse. October 6, 1996, Copenhagen, Denmark. The Hells Angels are throwing a party at their clubhouse on Titangade in the Norway district. It's a residential neighborhood, apartments everywhere, families. At around 1 a.m., someone positions themselves outside and fires a Carl Gustaf anti-tank missile directly into the building. The explosion killed 2 people, a Hells Angels prospect named Louis Linde Nielsen and a young man named Janne Krohn, who was a guest at the party. 3 others were seriously wounded by shrapnel. But here's what made this attack international news. The missile didn't just hit the clubhouse. Fragments ripped through the walls of neighboring apartments. Families, mothers, children, elderly people were showered with debris in their own homes. The blast blew out windows for blocks. Thomas Barker, a criminologist who studied MC-related violence, wrote about the Copenhagen attack in his 2007 book. He pointed out that this was a turning point, not just for the war, but for how governments across Europe viewed motorcycle clubs. Before this night, some politicians still treated biker violence as a policing problem. After this night, it became a national security issue. And here's the part that should make you stop and think. Both clubs, the Hells Angels and the Bandidos, had always operated with at least some awareness of public image. There was an unwritten rule in outlaw culture: handle your business, but keep civilians out of it. This attack shattered that. An anti-tank missile in a residential neighborhood doesn't discriminate. It doesn't check who's wearing a patch and who's wearing pajamas. And both sides knew it. The Danish government's response was immediate and furious. Within weeks, the Danish parliament passed emergency legislation. They called it the Rocker Law, which gave police the power to ban motorcycle clubs from establishing clubhouses in residential areas. It was the first law of its kind in Europe. The government literally changed the law because of one attack. From the law enforcement side, this was long overdue. Scandinavian police had been begging for more tools for years. The Danish National Police Commissioner at the time publicly stated that outlaw motorcycle clubs had become a threat to national security. But from the club's perspective, and this is where it gets complicated, some members saw the new laws as a massive overreach. Not just the bikers who were fighting the war, other clubs too, support clubs, even some civil liberties groups raised concerns. They argued that you can't ban an organization from owning property just because some of its members committed crimes. That's collective punishment. And here's what's interesting. Historians who've looked at this since have come down on both sides. Some researchers have argued that the Danish Rocker Law set a legal framework that the government later used for other security threats, essentially proving that emergency laws aimed at one group tend to expand over time. Others argue the law literally saved lives. And honestly, both sides have a point. That's what makes this so complicated. By the time the dust settled, the numbers were staggering. Between 1994 and 1997, the Great Nordic Biker War saw at least 11 people killed, over 80 wounded, more than 70 attempted murders, dozens of bombings and arsons, anti-tank weapons used at least 3 separate times, 11 dead, 80 wounded, in countries with some of the lowest violent crime rates on Earth, countries where most police officers don't even carry guns on routine patrol. The contrast is almost impossible to wrap your head around. It's like hearing about a tank battle breaking out in a library. Everything about it feels wrong, and that's exactly why it shocked all of Europe. The war didn't end with one dramatic ceasefire. It ground to a halt. By mid-1997, both sides were exhausted. Members were dead, others were in prison. Clubhouses were bombed out shells, and the police pressure had become overwhelming. Raids were happening every week, assets were being seized, and governments across Scandinavia had made it very clear this will not continue. On June 25, 1997, representatives of both the Hells Angels and Bandidos sat down and agreed to a truce. The ceasefire was announced publicly. Both clubs issued statements. The Angels released a brief comment through their European leadership. The Bandidos did the same. It was businesslike, almost corporate. No emotion, no looking back, just a handshake and a decision to move on. Whether you see that as cold-blooded or practical depends on how you look at the world. But was it really over? Sources disagree on this one. Some investigators believe the truce was genuine, that both clubs realized the war was destroying their business operations and attracting way too much heat. Others argue it was just a strategic pause, that the fighting went underground and continued in smaller, less visible ways for years afterward. The truth? It's probably somewhere in the middle. The open, large-scale violence stopped, but the tensions between the Hells Angels and Bandidos in Scandinavia never fully disappeared. Flare-ups have happened since, in 2008, in 2016, and as recently as the 2020s. The truce held the line, but it didn't erase the grudge.
For Scandinavian governments, the war left deep scars and deep changes. Denmark's rocker law became a model for other countries. Sweden tightened its weapons laws. Norway cracked down on cross-border club activity. Finland increased surveillance of MC organizations. But for the communities that lived through it, the families on Titangade in Copenhagen, the neighbors in Helsingborg, the legacy was personal. Some of those people had to rebuild their homes. Some still carry shrapnel scars, and most of them had nothing to do with any motorcycle club. That's the part of this story that doesn't get talked about enough. We focus on the clubs, the patches, the power, the weapons, and yeah, that's the story. But there were ordinary people caught in the middle of this who never asked to be part of it. A kid sleeping in an apartment next to a clubhouse doesn't know anything about territory or patches. They just know the wall exploded. Danish journalist Lars Nygaard covered the aftermath extensively for DR, Denmark's public broadcaster. He interviewed residents of Nørrebro who described living in fear for years. One woman told him she still flinched at loud noises a decade later. And what's remarkable is that despite everything, the bombings, the rockets, the body count, both the Hells Angels and the Bandidos still operate in Scandinavia today. They still have clubhouses, they still hold runs, they still fly their patches. You can't help but ask, was anything actually solved? The war burned itself out, laws changed, people went to prison, but the clubs are still there. The tension is still there, and the question that started the whole thing, who gets to control Scandinavia's biker world, was never really answered. It was just postponed. The Great Nordic Biker War lasted roughly 3 years. It killed at least 11 people, wounded dozens more, and saw military weapons fired in some of the safest cities on Earth. It changed laws, it changed how Europe's governments think about motorcycle clubs, and it forced two of the biggest outlaw organizations in the world to sit down and admit, even if they'd never used this word, that they'd gone too far. But here's what stays with me about this story. It's not the rockets, it's not the body count, it's how fast everything escalated. In 1993, this was a rivalry. In 1994, it was a conflict. By 1996, it was a war with anti-tank missiles. 3 years, that's all it took to go from bar fights to battlefields. And that tells you something real about human nature, about what happens when pride meets power, meets territory, and nobody's willing to back down first. The Nordic Biker War is often forgotten outside of Scandinavia. Most Americans have never heard of it. Most Europeans only vaguely remember it. But for the people who lived through it, and for anyone who wants to understand how outlaw motorcycle culture really works, it's one of the most important stories ever told. Because it proved something that both the clubs and the governments already knew, but nobody wanted to say out loud. When the 1%er world goes to war, that's the term for clubs with the 1% diamond patch, meaning they live outside society's rules. When that world goes to war, it doesn't stay in that world. It spills over into neighborhoods, into airports, into the apartments of people who never threw a punch in their lives. So here's what I want to know from you. When you look at the Nordic Biker War, was the truce a real sign that both sides learned something, or was it just a business decision, a strategic pause before the next round? Drop real peace or just a pause in the comments right now. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor, subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're diving into something just as intense, the Quebec Biker War, the bloody conflict between the Hells Angels and the Rock Machine that turned Montreal into the most dangerous city in Canada. A car bomb killed an 11-year-old boy on his way home, and that one death changed everything. You're not going to want to miss that one. I'll see you there.